planning. We've got 4 speakers today. We've got Roger Evans, Paul Reynolds, Andy Bateson and Andrew Raven. We may jiggle the agenda around a bit depending on speakers. Some speakers have got to come a bit later and go a bit earlier. So forgive me if I'm calling them in a different order to the order that's on the agenda. You can see the agenda in the chat bar. Few housekeeping things before we get going. Your microphones are automatically muted, but please don't let that stop you joining in. Use the chat function to make comments and post any questions that you would like to deal with at the end in the Q&A. I'll keep an eye on that chat and try and make sure that things don't get lost as they go up through the scrolling as things get added in. The webinar is recorded, which is, I'm sure we're all familiar with now. If at any time you lose your connection, just come back in on the link. If we lose connection, if the seminar goes down, we'll see if we can get it back. But if we find that we can't, we'll reschedule for another time. So in terms of the white paper and the direction of travel of planning reform, as I said, the white paper came out at the end of the summer last year, and it's widely expected there will be a planning bill in the summer of this year. So there will be a Queen's speech sometime in June and July, and it's expected there will be a planning bill in that session of Parliament. We wait to see what of the white paper makes it through to the bill, but there's no expectation that the main thrust of the white paper will not be being brought forward. I understand that there may be a view that the 3 zones may be too simplistic, so we may have 4 or 5, but the same approach is very likely to come through. And so that would mean that royal assent might be sometime in 2022. There's lots, of course, in the white paper, and it's not just whether you're in a zone for redevelopment or a zone for regeneration. And we'll cover some of that with some of the speakers today. So we might sit there and think, well, in 2022, we might have a different planning system. But as we will all know, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with, we're actually already in a very different system. So the government has for a long time been bringing out more permitted development schemes, changing the permitted development regime, perhaps is a better way of putting it. And in August last year, they allowed shops to convert to residential without the need for planning permission, which is probably the most significant change they have made so far under permitted development. So we already have a very different planning system. We no longer have a system where the usual approach of using planning policy to manage how uses come and go, that's no longer that is now changed with that shift to permitted development in town centres. And there's a lot of question about what's the role of planning policy now in terms of town centres. And now in the last, since Christmas, we've had the release of the I keep calling it a new model design guide, the new national design code. And some people I've heard saying, well, I think that doesn't quite fit with the deregulatory agenda, because design codes are quite precise, and that's their whole idea. I think that actually there is a philosophical relationship, because if the planning system through the planning applications process and policy is becoming effectively more of a licensing system, which is what we would seem to be the case, then actually the zoning approach fits very well with that, because you can have a license to do something that is specified in the code in a way that's much easier to deal with than the discretionary system that we have now. Now, that's just me speculating. That's my point of view. I may not be right. And I think it's not necessarily a different system. A licensing regime is not necessarily bad. It's just very different to what many of us have been used to. And I think when we look at reform, it's quite important to look at it quite dispassionately and say, well, what are the outcomes? What does it achieve? So for me, the removal of permission, the ability to change a shop into residential in a town centre, I think that is a bad reform, because it means we can't manage the process of making sure that our town centres remain good places from a retail perspective, because you might lose a plot right in the wrong place in terms of your high street. So I think that is a bad reform. But actually, taken as a whole, if we had a licensing approach, I could see it could be made to work. So it's not necessarily, the approach is not necessarily wrong, is what I suppose I'm trying to say. And it certainly fits much better with the digital agenda that is sweeping so much of our lives and not just planning. So that was sort of by way of a little bit of introduction to set the scene in terms of all these things that are going on. We have, sorry, just lost the right piece of paper here. We've got 4 speakers today. We've got Roger Evans. I'm sure many of you know Roger. Actually, before I run through that, let me just mention the poll that's on your screen. We're asking you some questions about your organisation's view of design, how well equipped you feel you are in dealing with the new design codes. So if you'd like to fill that in, we have quite good responses. It'd be great if you could complete those, and we'll share those results later. So we've got 4 speakers. Roger Evans, who, as I'm sure you know, is an architect and town planner specialising in urban design. And he's going to speak about the issues and opportunities presented by the white paper for urban form and master planning. We have Paul Reynolds, who is a chartered landscape architect and an urban designer. And he's the founding director of a planning and landscape design consultancy called Tapestry. And he's also honorary secretary of the Urban Design Group. And he's going to talk about what the Urban Design Group's view is of design codes and permitted development. Andrew Raven is the design director at Savills, working out of their Oxford office. And he's responsible for leading the team on major projects specialising in housing-led and mixed-use regeneration and strategic urban extensions. And he's going to speak on changes to the design process outlined in the white paper. And then we have Andy Bateson from Cherwell District Council, and he will be giving the local authority viewpoint. So a little bit ahead of time, that's no bad thing. We can get going with Roger's presentation, if that's all right with you, Roger?
Yes, all good.
Okay, over to you. I will give you you've got 20 minutes, and I will give you a sort of few minutes warning before the end.
Right, let me get. Good. Okay, thank you, Penelope, for the introductory note, which I found very, very helpful. I attended a webinar a couple of weeks ago, which was one of the speakers was Andy von Bradsky, who's head of architecture at the Ministry of Housing, Community and Local Government, and he said that the white paper would not be coming back in the same form, that several iterations would be required. So panic over, but please don't switch off. I'm sure the discussion will still be useful. The direction of travel sort of subtext that Penelope added to today's webinar, I think, is really useful. And I would summarize the direction of travel as being a greater concern about design and certainty of design. And I think it's about moving design considerations upstream in the planning process and giving greater certainty downstream. So if we look at the current local planning process, it's standard 7-8 steps, which always look something like this. And the initial steps are always very strong on written policies, possibly weaker on drawn proposals. And the first stage is always accompanied by a call for sites, which then figures in the later steps on the consultation. So the call for sites, all is required is a red line on an ordnance survey map to indicate a piece of land. And then these are logged as a spreadsheet. So although the planning policy background has been set, it is this call for sites, which is a technical assessment and not a policy making exercise, which really sets the pattern for the remainder of the consultation process. And the participation, I think, with local communities is not strong. I think any flip through of the responses to a local plan shows consultants on behalf of land promoters occupying most of the positions there with their proposals coming forward. And the result of this kind of exercise, where the call for sites is right at the outset, looks something like this. So trying not to identify this particular local authority, I've turned the plan upside down and left to right, but I think my colleague may have had the same idea and flipped it back, so maybe it is recognisable. But it is the sites with the fewest objections and the least complicated that are often chosen to go forward. And these sites are typically poorly connected. Many of the larger strategic sites are on the borders of political boundaries. These are the easiest sites to assemble because they've been put forward by landowners. And the resulting urban form is often really very poor because design decisions are being made not at this stage, but kicked down the road till the planning application comes in. So I think there has to be a better way of doing this, and some aspects of the white paper offer that prospect. Just to run through a sort of cartoon exercise of what happens with the call for sites, combined with opportunistic planning applications. If we take a simple market town, and look at the sites that are allocated on this process, they tend to be poorly connected sites where the land use proposed is segregated out. They tend to be single uses. They're often sites which require connecting up by a major road system, often presenting backsides to existing streets, often leaving the existing streets approaching the town over-engineered to cope with the load. And whether they are housing or retail sites, the attempt to provide centres in the middle, some kind of focus, is often flawed from the outset, because although the master plan might say in the middle of a site like this is a primary street, in fact it's a secondary or tertiary street when viewed in the wider context of the town. So we get inverted development with pseudo centres. And that pattern is replicated on out of town with strategic sites. And often when you look at sites like this, out of town, poorly connected, and you ask the question, what is it? Is it a village? Is it a market town? Is it an extension to an existing settlement? The reply is often from the promoter that it's a strategic allocation within the local plan to meet unmet housing need. And it's very difficult to tease out exactly what kind of settlement here is being proposed. And I recall a conversation with a promoter of a major site from the public sector, and when asked the question what this 3,500 houses was going to be, he simply said, well, we've not commissioned the marketing exercise yet, as if planning is a marketing exercise. So all of this is really quite a worry. If we look at what might be possible by bringing urban design considerations further forward, so an alternative approach to this might be, first of all, if there's a very clear urban form statement and appraisal of the whole town in terms of its character and urban form, then that can be extended to accommodate growth. Existing street networks can be extended. It does not have to be land use driven. And any economic appraisal is for the benefit of the whole town, of the whole settlement. So this is unashamedly a street-based urbanism where primary frontage is extended, intensified. Flexible mixed use is welcomed. Refurbishment of the public realm can be done on the back of a larger number of projects. The previous slide, which showed isolated development around a town, requires really quite heavy engineering to connect things up. So here's an example. On the right-hand side of this picture, there's a strategic housing site with a little centre in the middle, a local centre, which despite best intentions, one fears might struggle. On the left of this is a major retail site, almost impossible to cross the road, 6 lanes here. I've tried to do this on a bicycle. You take your life into your hands. And this is a direct result of major proposals coming in by landowners for isolated sites. And what might have been possible if there had been a strategic urban design input into this earlier on would be to say that the main road is not a barrier, is not a conduit just for traffic. It's actually a seam. This is an historic street. It used to be a toll road into this market town, and this could have been the focus for development, where other modes of movement would take greater priority, where the frontages would be active and traffic would be managed in a manner that was commensurate with this form of development. So it's not about the volume of traffic, it's the way in which that traffic is moving. So on the right, there's a sketch of what might have been done with a different approach. I think it's useful to think of urban design on 3 scales. And the first scale, which is often overlooked, is concerning the whole town. It's about the landscape setting and the landscape structure of the whole town, the underlying geology of the town, the movement structure, the network of streets, and the pattern of neighborhoods. And these are the clues for design and growth. It's possibly not till we come to the middle picture, where it's neighborhoods and new sites, that we start thinking, oh, this is where urban design starts. But this is a key stage. It's where design moves from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions. Master plan is a key document. And then if we drill down to design codes appropriate to street and plot, the detail of the master plan that might be attached. But design is always about looking up and down these scales. So decisions made at the town scale here has to have in mind implications for the neighborhood scale and also down to the street and plot, and vice versa. And if the first stage is omitted in a local planning process, so sites are being allocated, then it is small wonder that when it comes to designing a neighborhood, they turn inwards. And the streets, which should be the public realm, the common ground for the town, become simply conduits for high levels of traffic. So if we just take a step back at the moment from the pressures of the 5-year housing supply, housing need, all of the urgency, and think what we're trying to do as planners, it's surely trying to take the inheritance we have from our villages, towns, and cities. We intervene in some way and we leave a legacy for those that come after us. And we're very used now to the notion of natural capital, typically designed as the stocks of natural assets, including geology, soil, the biosphere, and that we are custodians of that. I think we also need to have an idea of urban capital, and that might be defined as a country or a town's stock of city form, including the street structure, the landscape structure, the public realm, that we in turn hand on to others. And I'm not sure that the urban form that we leave for next generations is particularly flexible or suitable for different uses that come along. So if we're serious about creating urban capital, it starts with the urban form character assessment in the local development plan, the landscape setting, how we intend creating and attenuating microclimate in growth areas, how street patterns are going to connect, the history of the settlement. And this is done with not just text, written policies, but also sketch plans which show options for growth and how this different pieces of town can evolve and people can adapt to their uses in future generations. So turning back to the strategic, to the local plan, in the first stage, there should be, I think, an urban form character assessment that the white paper is going to, by implication, require. Strategic urban design options would be beneficially set out at an early stage, but there's then an agreed vision by stage 3. Generic codes, I think, need to be produced, not at the end of the local plan process, but really at this stage. And what I call level 1 codes refer back to, on the left, the town plan. So this is setting out the main arterial streets of the growth of the town, the likely cross-section, the character and use of those streets. And those design codes could be further developed as required by the new model design code at a later stage once the examination in public has been completed and the inspector's report received. And it is not really until all of that has been done that it's appropriate to have a call for sites. So this is really turning that process on its head. And I think at present there's a gap in the thinking between the white paper and the new model design code, which assumes that local authorities will have the resources to produce highly detailed design codes on all the growth sites and other areas of change. So the design response to the white paper is that I think it offers the prospect of proactive planning. Well, can there be any other kind of planning? A more meaningful community engagement and the creation of what I'm terming urban capital. And that's an urban form that we can leave to future generations to make use of. My concerns are the resources required to do it, because local authorities need to take ownership of the process. And if design codes are simply left to the land promoters to produce, then we're no better off from where we are at the moment. And so I think there's a missing step between what is now a call for areas and the design codes. And that missing step is the strategic urban design input into the local development plans. And finally, an uncertainty as to whether local politicians will seize the opportunity to be proactive. So that's my 20 minutes. Thank you, Penelope.
That was an excellent presentation. Covered a lot of ground and a very good call for design to be strategic and not and for planning to be strategic and not just a process where we churn the handle. I was until recently head of planning at Wycombe District Council, and I can now speak more freely. But as a head of planning, I found one of the most frustrating things was how you get sucked into the process and how hard it is to keep your eye on that bigger strategic design piece, because the system almost works against you. So Maura, please can I ask you, do we have Paul Reynolds on the call?
Not yet, he's coming in about 10 minutes.
Okay, So in which case, Andrew Raven, can I call on you to come next, please? So
you certainly can.
Excellent. So I gave a brief introduction of you earlier from Savills, and you're going to run through some of the changes to the design process outlined in a white paper. So over to you.
Brilliant. So what my intention was to just review some of the background to the national planning policy framework changes that are currently under consultation. I think we've got until the end of the month.
Yeah, it's okay. I was just saying your slides were looking odd. They've just gone normal.
Yeah, my system is a bit slow, so you might have to bear with me. I've been in and out of the presentation, so yes, taking a look at where we currently are and the background to some of the current consultation. Really useful talk from Roger, and I think he puts it in such a logical way. I think there's a lot in there that could help form key thoughts in responding to the current consultation, which to my mind allows quite a lot of flexibility at the moment, and that might actually benefit from a little more prescription in the process that Roger outlines. Anyway, let's see if I can move this forwards. So just to quickly backtrack, as you were saying earlier, Penelope, we had the consultation last year on the white paper that's over, and government are currently considering responses to that. That consultation included the three pillars, a sort of zonal system, growth, no growth, regeneration, potentially the end of section 106, although I personally don't think that's likely, and then some sections on housing need and supply and first homes. So I'm cantering through this a little bit because I know Paul Reynolds didn't have much time, so I'm hoping to leave him an opportunity to start fairly promptly. So these are the three pillars, and I'm just going to focus in a little bit on planning for beautiful, sustainable places. Really enjoyed what's been coming through in the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, the B4C Commission, over the last couple of years, and I'm very keen to see those things implemented into the planning system. I think we've designed a lot of places that aren't beautiful over the last 20 years as a sector, with, I think, improvements over the last 5 to 10 years. Things have been getting better, but could be a lot better still.
Andrew, I'm just going to interrupt you. You don't need to canter because Paul can be with us for an hour, so you can do your presentation.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. So just a quick look at the three zones that were proposed: areas for growth, areas for protection, and areas for renewal. And what it seemed to me was the B4C Commission were looking to get buy-in to development through potentially using pattern books or area codes to get people on board about the type of places that might be built. So there was a potential policy change that areas of growth that are in the right places get allocated broadly and have planning in principle permission. That then means that the landowners or developers and the public know that those areas will be developed. So they're not reticent to engage when they can still object. They know the areas are coming forwards. They'll engage in the design process, and codes could come forwards at a fairly early level to define what development might be in those areas. And that's not so far what seems to be happening, because of course the current consultation is proposing changes to the policy framework and new requirements in advance of these changes. So the current consultation runs till the end of this month. If your local authority hasn't responded, I dare say this is a good opportunity to put some thoughts together. And I think Paul is going to talk about what the Urban Design Group is saying about this consultation. It comes broadly in three parts. You've got changes to the NPPF, you've got the National Model Design Code, and then the supporting guidance to the code. And there's some quite interesting little gems hidden within those. Although this is not the widespread change that was proposed in the white paper, it does raise design on the agenda. We've seen appeals refused on design grounds before, and perhaps local authorities sometimes need to be a bit more bold about doing that, and their ability to judge good or poor design. We see that this definition of sustainable development has been changed, and the term beautiful introduced for the first time. It's quite interesting hearing Nick Boyce-Smith, who's been leading the B4C team, saying that when they first started this work, it was called Better Building Beautiful, because they thought that more members of the public would engage when it's about building beautiful, because everyone knows what that means to them. Whereas if it was about quality design, members of the public engage less, and members of the profession engage more. And the work that his charity Create Streets have done has shown that members of the public and members of the profession have different views about what is quality design, which is very interesting, and probably warrants a whole debate on its own. In plan making, paragraph 22, I thought was quite interesting, that if you are planning large settlements or large expansions to settlements where strategic infrastructure is going to be required, it shouldn't be done piecemeal. You should look at putting together a 30-year plan. Of course, there are councils doing that. Milton Keynes now has a 2050 future planning, looking at planning in the wider area, but it's a move back towards regional planning. And we saw the ARC document recently published. All of this seems very sensible to get regional strategies in place and deliver strategic infrastructure. I liked the subtle change in paragraph 73 that also referred to large settlements, and probably really is hinting at garden communities and the work that the Transport for New Homes group published last year. If you haven't seen that, it's worth a read. They pretty much slate all of the garden communities that are coming forwards as not being really based on anything that's sustainable. They're not going to be particularly self-contained, and they're not well linked with public transport. And so this change would introduce a requirement that they are linked. I think the wording is something like they need to offer genuine public transport options. So interesting. And then section 12, of course, in the NPPF is the quality design section, and I won't go through all of the changes there, but two that I liked: early use of codes in paragraph 128, and we know that street trees has been a big thing for the Building Beautiful Commission. And paragraph 130, if implemented, would more or less make street trees mandatory and more green planting, which is also very interesting because it sort of forces an issue which has been bubbling away for years about how our streets are delivered. And when designers like us in consultancy say to our clients, why not deliver a few street trees? we often have the county against us because it's too difficult. And the developers, while some of them might actually want to implement that, find it's very difficult to implement. And in the end, what they want is their consent, so they won't bother. And we found that issue relates to all kinds of things, including putting walking and cycling first, where that should be the prime driver. But when you try and get junctions changed to put pedestrians and cyclists first, quite often you come across a highways authority that really wants traffic flow to be up there. So that will raise an interesting issue. And we have had at least 2 or 3 big clients who've come back to say, well, we shan't be putting street trees in all of our streets. Well, be interesting if that's mandated. These changes come with a variety of other changes as well. A Green Infrastructure Environment Bill, net biodiversity gain in there, and energy standards. It looks like the same slide. Just going to try and forward that on. So getting into the actual National Model Design Code, it's pretty logically based on the objectives that are in the National Design Guide. So follows on very logically from that. I'm not going to go into the code in a great deal of detail, but it's pretty logical, gives a lot of good examples and guidance, starting with what's the scope and who should use it. It's proposed that this is local authority led. I noticed the original letter that went out to local authorities said that these changes will be implemented within 3 years, but the letter that's currently on the government website has no timescale, and it wasn't clear what was to be implemented in any case. And I'm sure the testing of how this all works will be part of that process to look at timescales and what resources might actually be needed to implement these changes. So there's a lot of flexibility allowed. Documents could be overarching codes, which plenty of local authorities, South Oxfordshire, Vale of Whitehorse, already have. Joe will have a design guide, I think. It could be local authority wide, area wide, or these codes could just be specific plots. So there's quite a lot of flexibility in how councils might implement this, and there is the potential in there for councils to work on these with developers. As Roger says, it seems that having the resources for council to lead it would be the best method. And so there's a potential change to the way in which outline planning works, which is putting a code up front, doing some more detailed work before you look at your outline planning consent. And of course, codes normally, certainly detailed design codes, tend to follow on from outline planning applications. And again, this could work in many different ways, because you might have very high level codes that actually apply to a town and are built into policy in terms of how they should be applied to town development. So the model design code sets out this process, analysis, vision, code after you've scoped what you're going to do. And I have a read through if you haven't yet. It's all pretty logical. I think there's a guide that's twice as long as the National Model Design Code that supports the code, and the guide is a little not quite so logical, I think. In places, it's really good guidance as to how you might produce a code. In other places, it seems to go into quite a lot of detail about policies that could be used. And instead of being a guide, it becomes a kind of policy background document. Maybe others will have more to say about that. So just a quick look at these things. Your scoping of your code might just cover a few sites. And depending on capacity and resource, councils might deal with this in different ways. And as Roger says, that might not be the logical approach to local plans and allocation. There's a huge number of parameters that could be covered. But I don't think this should necessarily let local authorities be frightened who don't have much resource. Codes can be pretty high level, and the West End Code for Oxford is a good example of something that is that doesn't go into too much detail. If you get the chance to hear Robert Huxford from the Urban Design Group talk about codes and their history, he does a really good show on the development of building codes back before the planning process really got going, and how that impacted on street widths and building heights. And you can have a basic code that works in a similar way. One of the interesting things for me was on consultation. There's this drive for the planning process to become more digital, which we've had to do anyway over the last 12 months. And there have been some really good benefits from that. I did a stream of parish council meetings a couple of weeks ago, evening after evening, that would have taken me time to drive to, set up, present, go home, and everyone else. And they were done over Teams with a cup of tea in my hand. And I think potentially online consultation can reach an awful lot more people. I'm sure when we can, we'll go back to town and village halls as well. But I think there is an awful lot of opportunity to develop the online tools that we've been using over the last few years. What concerned me a little bit about what seemed to be coming forwards from the Building Better Commission was this requirement for measurable support from communities. It's pretty difficult to get support for development locally. And I saw that in the stakeholders group that was assembled at the end of last year, they had someone from Ipsos Mori on the team. And I did wonder if they were going to look at online models for voting on developments and potentially on codes. And I can see that being very difficult. What the guide sets out is, towards the end of the guide, there's a couple of pages on consultation, and it sets out a range of tools that could be used. And I think I may have put them up on this. Yeah, so it basically says that as before, consultation and engagement and how that works should be agreed with the local authority. It can use multiple techniques, including workshops, and that would include things like inquiry by design. We've been doing a lot of online workshops, and the digital tools for those are getting better and better. People using sticky notes and post-its and posting on screens. Quite exciting to engage a different demographic to what you normally get at the village hall consultation. So again, I think there's a lot of opportunities in the way we change our consultation. So we've got not long now to comment, till the 27th. I know there's a couple of local authorities that we know who've applied for the funding to test this out. Be interested if anyone on the call belongs to a local authority that's made a bid. 50k spread across those pilots. It isn't very much when a big design code can cost 50 to 100,000 pounds in itself. But good to be starting to implement this, see what the issues are, and work out how we can best deliver a change in the process. Deliverability and resourcing is something that across the industry has been a cause for concern, both for urban design group, the private sector and the public sector. We know a lot of local planning authorities don't have urban designers. I've mentioned street trees and highways implications, and I think a system that integrates those infrastructure considerations, like the way schools work, the way refuse collections work. We shouldn't have the tail wagging the dog, and our streets designed around contracts that have been let to refuse collectors that only have huge dust carts. We should be designing our streets for people, and then the contracts work for them. And deliverability has been another key issue and a little bit of a concern. I think in Cambridge and Oxford, not much of a problem, very good values. But one of the case studies for all of this has been Nansledden down in Cornwall. I'll just give a little background to that if people don't know. The Prince's Foundation did a small scheme in Newquay, in the town. They developed a pattern book with local people about what the Newquay vernacular was. Got a lot of buy-in, developed this small site for 270 homes, and had a fantastic response from the community. It was building in my backyard. Please give us more of this. We love it. And the council then allocated them a site for about 3,000 homes, which is Nansledden. And it's currently being delivered. If you get the chance, or if you're on holiday down that way, go and have a look. It's really good. But as you might expect, very high quality. I know quite often Poundbury and the Prince's Foundation schemes aren't seen as good precedents, but actually the foundation does have to make a profit. It's long-term profit, but it doesn't do things at a loss. And Nansledden is borderline loss-making because of the quality of materials and some of the requirements there. And we know that if very expensive materials are put into a code in somewhere in Tyneside with very low values, it just wouldn't be deliverable. So there has to be some recognition of the cost of delivering high quality design. Much of it there's no cost to at all, but for some elements there is a cost. And we have a little bit of a concern that too much planning by committee might stifle innovation on sites where it might be interesting to see different approaches and developers trying to generate a new market in house building style and detailing. So just some takeaway thoughts there, and I think we're probably having questions at the end. Penelope, I'll bring you back in. That's all from me.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Another very interesting presentation, and helpful to have it all rooted back into the 4Bs report that, of course, this all flows from. The level of detail of the coding, of course, is quite interesting with the prescription of the street trees. I must admit, I welcome that, and yet the old planning stooge in me that's been doing this for so long wonders whether it's really actually possible. And at that point, I think perhaps I've been doing this too long, because clearly, as Andrew has outlined, there are a whole range of reasons that are not necessarily good ones as to why we don't do it at the moment. Now, I understand that Paul has arrived. Paul Reynolds, can you hear me?
I'm here, yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So Paul is, as I said earlier, is Chartered Landscape Architect and Urban Designer and Founding Director of Planning and Landscape Design Consultancy Tapestry. And he's also the Honorary Secretary of the Urban Design Group. So he's going to give us a presentation on the Urban Design Group response to design codes and permitted development rights. So Paul, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. Right, I'll share my screen. I'm going to check that it's working and moving on, because yesterday I did a presentation and was 8 slides in before someone said that it was still on the first slide. So trying to avoid the same thing happening. Right, hopefully you can see that. Is that okay?
Yeah.
And is it going to move on is the next question.
Yep.
And does it change? Perfect. Okay, I'll go back to the beginning. Yeah, as you sort of said in the introduction, and apologies for being late. I'm halfway through an all-day workshop on a scheme down in Kent. But what I'm going to kind of do really is a whistle-stop tour through some responses that the Urban Design Group have made to the various consultations. I know you've sort of already heard from Roger, and a lot of the work he's been doing has fed into that. And actually Andrew just sort of touched on some of the stuff as well, which I'll come back to on the coding element. And really this kind of was trying to feed out of a question which we were sort of asking at executive committee around where does design begin in the planning process? And I think what we realised was that it very much does begin with policy, and actually, you know, it's sort of when you do design review, you often say, oh, you want to see a scheme really early on and not just before it's submitted. But actually, a lot of the decisions that have the biggest impact on whether a place can be successful or not are made sort of way before a master plan even gets started. And it is about the policy at the beginning. So sort of with that in mind, we, over the last few months, we've sort of addressed 4 topics or themes. So one was our response to the planning white paper. The second one is about ensuring design quality elements and sort of consistency with Manual for Streets 3, which is just started being produced, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. The third one is the model design code. I'm not going to touch on that in great detail, and Andrew's obviously just talked a bit about it in his presentation. And then the fourth one, and a really important one actually, we think, is the permitted developments right consultation, which closed a few weeks ago, which we also made a representation on. So start with the white paper. So basically, in order to inform our submission, we actually held 4 online Zoom sessions, as is the requirement these days to be online. And across those 4 sessions, we had over 1,000 participants. I appreciate that probably a lot of those were on all 4 sessions, but it was still a fantastic turnout, certainly more than we've ever been able to sort of get together in the UDG basement in Clerkenwell. So I think from that point of view, it sort of Zoom can be a real benefit for getting people together and getting views. And we kind of had 4, I suppose, themes that came across from that and which we responded on. One was the strategic issues, the headlines. The second one was the digital. Third being design codes and guidance, and fourth being about delivering quality urban design. So the strategic issues, I think the sort of the 4 key things for us that we wanted to talk about in this was the idea of policy having to be underpinned by place, and actually, you know, a real thought and understanding of the place, and working with the communities to understand how they see their places, being something that needs to be undertaken very early on in the process and used to inform the process. Roger's obviously referred to that in light of the kind of strategic urban design work, and I think that really is a fundamental aspect of it. The second one was about linking spatial planning to industrial strategy. Now, I understand in recent weeks, it looks like the industrial strategy has been a bit sidelined in various government announcements, which is a real shame, because actually, you know, what we do know is that there's a real mismatch between sort of where people want to live and where pressure for housing in particular is greatest, and that kind of wider industrial strategy and where jobs are. And what we want to see is a much greater link, one that was kind of lost with the abandon of regional spatial strategies, to kind of bring that back together and that kind of really big picture thinking, so that we're not just putting houses where the land values are the highest and the demands are greatest, but actually putting it where we need it and sort of to help create more balanced and vibrant communities. The third one was around a systems approach. So working to a kind of common vision, and that covered a lot of different areas. It was talking about considering things like land use planning and taxation. So, you know, the proposal in the white paper to have growth areas, renewal areas, protected areas, and the simple fact that in growth areas you'll have 0% VAT effectively because it'll be new development, while in renewal areas and protected areas you've got 20% VAT. So actually, how can you incentivize development in renewal areas rather than growth areas, i.e. the old brownfield rather than greenfield, when you've got this kind of mismatch in the VAT strategy, and really everything working towards that that common vision, whether it's, the funding streams, transport planning and kind of the strategic transport work, and also things like the highway design, street design, and also about how you can kind of get approvals and streamline approvals should all be working towards that common vision. And again, the fourth one there being the strategic urban design required at plan making stage, which I know you've already heard about. The second theme was the digital futures, and I think what came out of our workshops was that there is a real desire to embrace digital. There are a number of things going on already, but what was certainly highlighted was the fact that the data and the quality of data is going to be central to that delivery. I think there was a lot of advantages in real-time feedback. The idea that you could potentially develop a master plan, and as you're designing it, you would be told if your buildings were going to be non-compliant because they didn't meet a code or a particular technical requirement, but also that we need to have an open source approach and standardized data sets, because otherwise we're going to have real issues where we're on the boundaries, and obviously across sort of political boundaries we might have different standards which we need to avoid. And also the idea that things like View City, which a lot of local authorities, I know particularly in London, use, and I think even more broadly now, but at the end of the day that's still a private company who you have to sign up to and pay for, and kind of how can that be more aligned to what we've seen in London with the GLA data store, where vast amounts of information are actually made available as GIS layers that anyone can access. And much like planning as a whole, there's also the issue with skills and training, obviously. To bring in all these new digital tools, a lot of them do require upskilling and training, and as we know, there is a distinct lack of underfunding and under-resourcing of local planning authorities. And while in the long term some of these can probably sort of release some of the burden of some tasks by digitising them, at the same time there is a need to upskill and train those in using the new tools. And also the fact that digital tools could be a lot more useful for civic engagement, and that kind of bringing local communities along, getting them engaged early, and as we've sort of seen again, and Andrew touched on, with local people being sort of more enthused through Zoom perhaps, and they are getting a broader range of people to physical meetings. I think that's a kind of good example of that. Then on the third point on design codes, I think what we wanted to touch on here really was the idea that they need to be standardized and not have too much variation. And obviously this was something we talked about kind of in advance of the model design code coming out. So some of this overlaps with what we're seeing, some of it doesn't. Apologies, I think the pictures cut the end of the word off. But yeah, it was just to be standardized, not too much variation. The fact that community input is essential, and what we've obviously seen is that that's very much the model that's being put forward, is almost that the community will develop its design code and then development as it comes along will follow it. That integration with street design guidance, at the moment there are far too many conflicts between street design guidance, whether the right street design guidance is followed or not. We frequently see the county highways teams kind of requiring things which undermine district councils in terms of their aspirations for quality places. So having that integration is going to be critical. And also the idea that we can have pre-approved construction details, and that's something again that feeds back through to the sort of digital piece around the replication of a lot of work which we can get rid of if we have the right tools. The fifth point on design codes was around mandatory housing design standards and that interface with building control, and actually whether there are elements and features of our towns and cities which could be moved into more of a building control role rather than a development management role. Andrew mentioned the presentation that Robert Huxford gave, which was really interesting, and talked a little bit about that. It's actually on YouTube, so I would kind of recommend you to look it out. The link's on the Urban Design Group website. It is really interesting. And then also the kind of idea about how we can amend design codes. If they're easy to amend, then they're kind of worthless because everyone will come along and just alter the design code to what they wanted to do anyway. But at the same time, we do need to have a mechanism so that where once schemes start to be delivered, in accordance with the design code, if there are things that aren't working, there's a kind of feedback mechanism to allow that to be fed in and the design code to be updated accordingly. And then finally, the fourth point was just about the kind of overall delivery. And I think what we needed to see was some kind of body or organisation that has oversight of this. There will need to be an element of local authority enforcement. Possibly there could be sort of external enforcement. I think it's the active travel task force. Just check my note. That's being brought in on sort of the highways and movement side. Yeah, the Active Travel England, that's the one, which is the model that's being looked at. Is something we can also think about. And also the model for delivery. We very often see large developments being brought forward by a large volume house builder, and that can sort of erode some of the variation and the natural variation you get with places that grow organically over time. So actually, is there a model where a landowner retains some sort of controlling interest? I know sort of years and years ago, the work that was being done in Harlow at Abode was sort of done on that model with a master developer and then individual developers brought in and working to a design code. And that's, I think, still a very good example of it. And then finally, as I just said before, that this idea that there is some mechanism for adopted design codes to be updated and amended as they go forward. So the second thing was the Manual for Streets 3, and I think it's very clear through the work that was done in the Housing Design Audit for England that actually, so much of our new development is dominated by roads. It's a lot of floor area and a lot of space in schemes is taken up by roads, very often to the detriment of them. It's not something that's attractive. It's not something that's pleasant to look at. And while there are new guidance documents, obviously Manual for Streets, there was Manual for Streets 2, which wasn't a mandatory document, but was brought out to try and deal with some of the issues that came about from Manual for Streets. And as I touched on, we're now, the CIHT are now in the process of writing Manual for Streets 3, and I think we're hopeful that Manual for Streets 3 is going to be really closely integrated with the kind of outputs from the Planning White Paper and from the National Model Design Code, because we really do need to ensure that that these links are made, and that once it's published, that people follow it. I mean, we still see a lot of DMRB design standards coming about in the public realm design, which isn't, which is something we should be moving away from. And in fact, just recently, this hopefully everyone will be familiar with the Building for a Healthy Life, the new the latest update to Building for Life document. And in here it's got what green looks like and what red looks like, and it talks in here about red being wide and sweeping corner radii 6 meters or more, and yet still in the majority of schemes we see local highway authorities demanding 6 meter radii on corners in residential neighbourhoods. And then people wonder why we get the stuff on the bottom page that everyone hates rather than the stuff on the top. And I think what we really want to see is this latest thinking also on things like cycling infrastructure really being embedded in the design process through Manual for Streets 3, but cross-referenced through the National Model Design Code. So on the National Model Design Code, we've had 2 online sessions to talk about this. The first one was an introduction to it and what it covers. The second one was about the history of design codes that Robert Huxford gave. As I said, that those first 2 are now available on YouTube, so please do have a look at them. It's definitely worth watching. And then our second session, the sort of bigger one, was on the key themes discussion. That was actually last night. Hopefully, maybe some of you joined us for that. And we sort of went through a number of topics: movement and transport, planning, property, water, trees and environment, community skills and resources. If you weren't online for that last night, that will also be up on YouTube in about a week or so. And then kind of based on these 2 events, we're going to put together some thoughts and provide some feedback on that, the National Model Design Code. And just so really that's just talking about how it kind of fits into that process. Obviously, we have the National Design Guide that came out, and now the National Model Design Code, and then how that feeds into individual design codes that we see coming forward for places like Northstone. I'll skip over that one. And I think the key thing really for us is that how can we work with local communities to capture the sense of place and the kind of essence of what their towns and villages are, so that they can ensure that when growth comes forward, which it is bound to do, that they really feel that it represents a kind of extension of their existing area and not an alien creation sort of adjacent to it. And then the final thing, and one which I think is quite important, but maybe slightly more overlooked, is the recent permitted development rights consultation. It's a lot less glamorous. It doesn't have a flashy cover like Planning White Paper did. But really, it was kind of in two parts. It talks about supporting housing delivery and public service infrastructure. The first part was about broadening permitted development rights, and that was mostly linked to allowing all land uses under the new use class E, which I'll touch on in a second, to basically be converted to residential under PD. And the second part was around public service infrastructure, which was more around allowing schools, prisons, sort of other institutional buildings to enlarge, add floor space within their sites under PD. And while that does have some issues, I think our primary concern really was the first part of it, around the permitted development right for use class E. And obviously, this is a slide from a presentation I gave a couple of years ago before the use, or a year ago before the use class E came in. And the idea was, you know, does the current planning system and all the use class orders really reflect how we live? And this sort of notion that life is a lot more complex than the use class order system. But, you know, the reality is we have high streets such as this, where shops are boarded up. You know, there's a lot of vacant retail floor space. And while COVID has seen a slight shift, you know, we see people queuing to get out of shops. And I know certainly my local high street has probably been busier over the last year than it has been for many years. There is still this kind of issue with our retail centres and our high streets, and the work of the High Street Task Force, which is, you know, still relatively new as an entity, starting to look at it. But we did a piece of work for the GLA a couple of years ago now, under the Mayor's Good Growth Fund, and we came up with this notion of something called Use Class F, which was for Use Class Flexible, which really was just saying, you know, there's a lot of vacant retail floor space. We were also particularly looking at retail in new buildings which couldn't be let or wasn't being let, and you just had a kind of empty ground floor space. And part of the reason was that inflexibility and the fact that it discourages people from trying things for a brief period. And was there a way of having a much more flexible use that would allow people to try things without having to worry about planning issues? There's plenty of other costs and issues around sort of taking a permanent space, and we felt that a new use class could be one way around it. So we were actually quite pleased when use class E came out. It kind of addressed a lot of these issues that we were talking about. And you know, you see shops like this, which appear here, run sort of empty internet cafe in this case, which, you know, someone just turns into a pop-up store, and with relatively little furniture or cost, someone that maybe makes some their own clothes or sort of refurbished clothing can open a shop, can try it out, see whether it works, decide if it's for them, and if not, move on. And if it is, then brilliant, you know, it's a new independent retailer on the high street. But even with that, you're never going to be able to deal with every empty shop, and sort of scenes like this in high streets can be a real issue, and they can really kind of degrade the overall high street and the wider shopping area. And there's kind of been a push towards this idea of converting to resi, which actually I'm kind of quite supportive of. I think there is definitely a place for reducing the retail footprint on our high streets and converting some of them to residential. And there are some fantastic examples like these of how, you know, old shops can be converted quite successfully into residential spaces, and they kind of have a nice character all of their own. They're clearly residential, but they're also clearly, you know, were once retail. But unfortunately, you also get a lot of this. This is actually just up the road to me in East London, and you know, this is not even under permitted development. This is kind of, you know, got planning permission, you know, for what is actually a pretty grotty conversion of a shop. There's loads of them in this particular parade. Probably every third or fourth shop has been converted in this way. It doesn't look great. The viability of that whole parade is undermined really by the fact that you have these units, so you end up with a kind of gap-toothed high street. People don't want to use it when they've got one shop and then they've got to walk past 6 effectively houses to get to the next shop. And what we actually need is a much more managed approach. And documents like this one, which was published last month by Create Streets, looking at exactly this point and about basically saying that design codes could be the answer for how you can allow retail units to be repurposed into residential by the use of design codes, which is fine, and maybe that will overcome some of those aesthetic arguments against what we saw on the previous slide. But what it doesn't do is deal with this issue of it undermining the high street. And actually, if you've got a high street that's struggling, you know, that needs to be looked at carefully. It needs to be right sized. There needs to be thinking about what's the best way of doing it. And, you know, sort of maybe taking a couple of retail units off each end of a high street and condensing down the shops that are there and are viable to the centre so that they're together is the way of doing it, rather than taking out every third or fourth shop and putting residential in, because it's just going to completely undermine the high street. And, you know, with one hand, the government announces millions of pounds towards high street task force and improving high streets, and then on the other hand, it sort of suggests that anyone that wants to can convert a retail shop into residential. And obviously, you know, it's very clear that with land uses and land values there, you know, there's even a risk that they'll just put rents up on perfectly viable businesses to force them out so that they can then convert it, because there'll be no incentive for them to keep retail uses in there. And what we really want is this, and this is my local high street in Wanstead, and it's, you know, like I said, it's probably been busier over the last year than it has ever been. It's got a good mixture of independent stores and branded stores, and actually, you know, I think there's a lot to be said for this approach and this model, and this is something we should be aiming for in our town centres. That's me done. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. A lot to cover there, but then there's been a lot of stuff going on in the world of planning and design. So thank you for taking us through all of that. And I think I'm glad the way you summed up that retail issue. Like you, I think Class F, as you coined it, makes a great deal of sense. But let the retail uses change to other active front uses. Don't just make the ability for them to become resi in the middle of a high street, because it just makes no strategic sense at all. And going back to Roger's talk, which sadly you missed, but I'm sure you are familiar with what he would say, you know, design is also a strategic thing. It's not just a matter of being done on the building. So I'm now just going to do something a bit strange and ask if Andy Bateson is on the call under a different name. So we have Andy Bateson to be a speaker, but we don't have Andy Bateson on the call. And I just wonder if his name is showing as something else on Zoom. But there is a resounding silence. So no, I think we're going to have to accept that Andy hasn't been able to make it today. So that's something of a shame, because it's really important to get a local authority viewpoint. I'm going to take a few minutes to share some thoughts, because as I said a little while ago, it's not so long since I stopped having a local authority viewpoint of my own from Wycombe District Council, which of course has now been merged into Bucks. But one of the things that I would reflect on is the difficulty of matching the planning process to the design process. And we've never actually managed to do this. So my background is as an urban designer. That's what I did for a number of years before I became a manager and inherited planning policy and then inherited a whole planning department. And it wasn't until I became head of planning that I realised just how incompatible design and planning, the planning system really are, and how much the system drives what you do. So I was head of planning at Wycombe for about 6 years, from 2013 to the summer of last year. And the local plan had just started as I took over the job. So it had been scoped. The first wave of consultation was just beginning in my first month. And it was adopted in 2019. So I had actually no input into that plan. I managed it. And as the government changed the goalposts, we shifted this and we shifted that. But our whole focus was on the 5-year housing land supply, because if we didn't manage to snaffle that, then we knew we were at risk of losing sites that we didn't want to lose. And it became a game of cat and mouse. And the mental capacity that you have to actually then apply what you know you should be doing to what you have to do, actually it almost becomes an impossible ask. The other thing to bear in mind from the point of view of a planning authority is that you're not running a service where money doesn't need to be taken into account. Sorry, that's a pretty bad way of putting it. But effectively, you're running a business. And again, speaking from my own personal experience, I had the job of making the planning department cost neutral. I had to find a way of making it a financially viable business model, because the alternative was to have cuts and have even fewer planners to do the work that was necessary. And we didn't have enough planners to do the work that we needed to do. We did a lot of work, and this isn't saying that what we did was in any way unusual. Many authorities are doing a lot of work around digital, cutting out steps, cutting out costs and all that sort of stuff. But what I don't see in the new design coding world is the business model. And that might be a bit of a strange thing to say. It requires a huge amount of effort up front. Now, there's a really sustainable business model with a really high quality pre-app service, because you can serve, and we did this at Wycombe, you can serve your clients, your paying clients, who are different from your customers. Your customers are your third parties, your residents, your neighbours and so forth, but your paying clients, you can deliver a commercially viable service if you're delivering a good quality thing that helps them get the development in the right place in the right way. But that's once they are already there and they've made some commitments. And all this requires us, and I'm not saying this is wrong at all, this requires local authorities to be able to do things up front. There's a big part of me that's delighted at this coding agenda, and it's what Roger was saying about design being something that should happen before you make your local plan. You know, the sites you choose are crucial to getting a well-designed place, but it's how you fund that. And I don't know that there's enough discussion about the whole business of business case. Something that struck me from what Paul said, he had a slide on it, and on that slide was a phrase that I've almost stopped hearing, which was sense of place. And we've become so system oriented, if I can put it that way, that we've forgotten that actually planning is about trying to create that sense of place. So perhaps it's a good thing that the planning system is being sort of shaken up, and the things are being thrown into the air, and we're going to see how it lands, because it wasn't doing a good job. There are far too many things, you've shown the photographs, far too many things that have been being built in the last decade that are not what we know we can build. But given the resourcing issues, it's quite a risky strategy to throw it all up in the air in the way that it seems to be happening at the moment, especially given that we are doing things like undermining our high streets, which we absolutely can't afford to do. So that was a little bit of reflection of an ex-head of planning. And if anybody wants to join me for a counselling service later, and where we can all drown our sorrows, if only we could say, let's go to the pub after this. It would be a bit early, given we finish quite soon, and we can't do it anyway. So what I'm going to do is invite the panel to, well, not invite the panel to come back. Well, put your cameras back on. We haven't had many questions coming through on the chat. So whilst I'm giving you all who are in attendance here some time to think about the things you want to explore, I would just remind you about the poll. Maura sent out a poll with various questions, and if you haven't completed that, I'd be grateful if you can do that. And I now see that Andrew Raven has raised a hand.
Yeah.
So, Andrew, would you like to say something?
I was actually going to backtrack a little bit and ask Roger Evans a question. It's so logical, the process that he proposes for how towns and villages and cities expand, and yet it's not the process we use at the moment. Are there, and I really like the idea of pseudo centres. When Roger was explaining about the centres of walkable neighbourhoods effectively not being on the real primary streets because they're quite often internalised. Actually, Savills have done a lot of work on that in terms of value, and how you can use the street syntax or connectedness tools in GIS to show where those local centres should go. Really interesting. But yeah, in terms of proper growth of towns, I wondered if Roger's got examples of, is that being done elsewhere in the world or elsewhere in Europe? Is that a model in other places?
Well, for the rest of Europe, it's the normal way of doing things. For planning, you make a plan, then you consult on it. If I can paraphrase a very good article on the Academy of Urbanism website at the moment by Nick Falk, he summarizes the system in Denmark, which is, there's a land tax on undeveloped land. So if your land is zoned for a residential use, there's an incentive to bring it forward and develop it, otherwise you get taxed. So the Danish planners will plan out growth areas, but the landowners are able to participate in that process, so they know what's coming down the line. And at the point at which development is ready to go ahead, they are liable for tax on the land if they don't bring it forward. And that seems a very efficient way of doing things. One of the criticisms I've had of what I outlined for the English system is, well, if you don't check if the land's available, you can get to the end of your plan and you don't know that it's deliverable. But a glance at any local plan map showing who's put in to have their land developed, it's almost blanket coverage. I mean, most of the land around English villages and towns is already optioned. I forget the exact percentage, but there's a stunning figure. It's like 85, 90%. It's all optioned. So if you got to the point of developing your plan, I don't think there's going to be much of a problem nobody wanting their land to be used. If there was, then you'd have to think if you can work around it or it's a compulsory purchase. But I don't think that's really the problem. I think the nux of the issue is that if you have a more proactive planning process for design, then it really needs to be accompanied by a more proactive delivery mechanism. And local authorities don't really get that involved in delivering the plans. It assumes that all manner of development pressures are out there, and all you got to do is filter out the ones you want from the ones you don't want, and it will happen. Well, it doesn't. I don't think it works like that, as I've tried to explain. So I think in saying where else does it work, we can look all across Europe, certainly. And the countries we see good development exemplars coming out of, Denmark, Sweden, the Malmö docks regeneration, or Hammarby, Swiss, German, French example, lots of Dutch, Vinex, the new towns. It's been a proactive approach, but they've also, planning has worked hand in hand with delivery and implementation. So I think that's the elephant in the room. And the current white paper proposals and the design code proposals, I'm in favour of design codes. If it's simply a matter of, because local authorities haven't got the resource to do the design code, so you say, well, there's a site allocated over there, and it's no longer going to be called call for sites, it's call for areas. So this area comes forward and we'll ask that promoter to prepare a design code for it. Well, that happens at the moment, either immediately after the outline planning application or increasingly with it. So there's a missing link. There's a missing link with the white paper and all the various documents that the speakers have outlined. There's a missing link, which is the kind of strategic approach to design that Penelope has also drawn attention to. And that's what needs to go in there. And aligned to that is the delivery mechanism, because it's also about the funding. How is this upfront work going to be funded? And you might say, well, it's moving resources from development management end of planning forward. So there's an immediate cost to that, after which it might balance out. But I think the European systems, which are more proactive in their planning, is aligned to land taxation, which is funding the planning system to do this very necessary work up front. Sorry, that's a long answer to a very short pertinent question.
A very interesting answer though, and I'll just add in a two-penneth in a moment. However, before I do that, Maura's just sent the poll again. I'm afraid we had a technical glitch. So those 32 of you who voted, I'm afraid you need to vote again. And please, can the other 40 or so of you also vote? Sorry about that, but it would be helpful if you can fill it in the next couple of minutes, and then we'll review those results before we finish. So whilst you're polling, I'll add in a little bit of what Roger was talking about problem of delivery, and share with you some of the difficulties we had at Wycombe. We were doing an urban extension of Princess Risborough, which is a little town between High Wycombe and Oxford. It was in multiple land ownerships, and we allocated it in the plan for an extension. And we tried to work with the developers. We had Taylor Wimpey, Persimmon, Waits, and Blore, and a regional house builder from East Anglia, Halsbury Homes. None of them had a majority stake, and we only had planning powers. We had no land ownership. We did discuss as a council whether we needed to try and option some of this land early doors when we were first floating as a consultation the fact that this needed to happen, but we decided in the end that we were, Wycombe was a district council, and actually to get engaged in the land optioning and land buying business for a district council whose balance sheet isn't that great, it's actually quite a big risk, looking at it again as a business, not as a planning issue, whereas a county council or a big unitary has a much bigger balance sheet, and so it can take bigger risks with property. But so we decided we couldn't actually try and get our foot in the door as a property owner, and that meant the only leverage we had was planning. And we were trying to, in theory it all worked. We ran the viability, we got consultants working with the county council to prepare plans for the road. It wasn't a bypass, but it obviously needed decent infrastructure and the railway bridge changes and all that. It was quite expensive, but it all worked through. It went through the local plan examination, but we really struggled with delivery. I'm not now clear where that story's got to, but we couldn't get the landowners to work together. Latterly, they did begin to come together, but they weren't willing to really work with us collaboratively. It was still, well, you'll do this bit and we'll do that bit. There was no basis of trust. And we could see this thing, we could see how it could happen, but we couldn't bring it to bear. And we couldn't start compulsory purchasing. It would have been completely impossible. So yeah, the delivery side is a really, I think you said, Roger, it's the elephant in the room. Paul, do you want to add anything on this question? Come on, floor. You need to give us some questions in the chat. There must be all sorts of things going on in your offices. Catherine Pierce, thank you very much. You've put something in there. While I'm reading Catherine's comment in the chat, Paul, is there anything that you wanted to add to what we've just been talking about?
No, I mean, I think, to be honest with you, I kind of agree with what everyone's said. I don't know if there's much that I can add to it, really. No, I'm happy to, if there's other questions, I'm happy to move on.
Okay, well, let's read out Catherine's post. She says, I think it was Andrew who raised the concern that planning by committee might stifle innovation. In my experience, house builders are not all that innovative. Am I allowed to say boom boom there? They have their own pattern books. I think it's partly because they are worried that anything too out of the ordinary might not sell. How can we encourage new ways of thinking? Will design codes be able to achieve that? Now, who would like to go first?
Happy to come back on that briefly first.
Okay.
I think that's right. Basically, the volume builders do have their own pattern books, and you can see a potential for them to adapt those in accordance with local design requirements. But if you took that down to Nansleddon and the process that happened there, local people wanted new housing to reflect the local vernacular, and that doesn't really allow any room for modern methods of construction, perhaps, or some different thinking on what buildings might look like. But perhaps the way around that is on larger schemes to break the community down a little bit. There's always some people that like to see something that's more innovative, or uses different materials. So when you look at something larger, maybe there's a requirement to deliver different types of architecture. And that seems to me, in theory, to work quite well with what Letwin Review was saying in terms of bigger sites having more diverse housing typologies. We need retirement living, we need flats and apartments, we need suburban housing, but we also need high density terraces. Ensuring that mix comes forwards is quite difficult if you're working with one client or volume builder that only delivers one type of product. But I think there are ways around that to kind of encourage innovation, if you like. I suppose that's the answer to Catherine's question, but I tend to agree with the sentiments of it.
Roger, Paul, which of you would like to go next?
I don't want to go next. I think, I totally agree. And I think what we actually need to do is to encourage more diversity into the mix in terms of the delivery. Large house builders are delivering products. They don't have a long-term vision, and a lot of it is, a lot of the problems we see is because they just, once they've sold them, they move on to the next one. For them, it is about building and selling a product. They know what their customers like, and they build what their customers want, and they're happy to move on. I think what we need to do is to introduce more into that mix in terms of getting more smaller and medium-sized house builders who are more willing to innovate and who will look to innovation and difference as their kind of USP. And I think that's going to be critical to it. I think design codes are definitely one step towards it, but I would be anxious that you'll still get a standard whatever, the red row house. It's just that the stone cladding which goes up to the downstairs window will be a different stone in Cornwall to what it will be in Birmingham, and it will just be all the local people doing is choosing what stone is used to clad it, but otherwise the building's identical. And I think we need to move away from that to more genuine understanding of local character. And I think it's also to do with urban form. It's to do with the layout of houses. I remember doing a design panel once where it sort of struck everybody that a particular town, loads and loads of houses had rounded corners on them. It was just a weird quirk of the way that town had been developed. And actually, that was identified as being a really fundamental local feature, was just these rounded corners. And actually, far more so than a particular slate on the roofs or a particular brick. It was those elements which were most critical to that sense of place.
Roger, do you want to?
Well, just to add, I do think volume house building is part of the problem, and it's something that happens in England, and it's almost as if the development system or the planning system is in cahoots with the volume house builders. And if we look at good examples from other countries, they've got far more diversity in how they're building out growth areas. The banking system and mortgages, it's far more diverse and funded, so there's other funding sources. I think one thing we can do here in this country is to encourage or make provision for self-build, custom build, alongside volume house building. At the moment, that's seen as a little bit niche. I'm aware Charwell's doing a huge custom build scheme, but I think if there was a lot more custom building going on, I'm thinking of places like Vauban, where they are building at rates. Vauban has been built out at completion rates of 4 or 5 times greater than a volume builder outlet would be in this country. So a volume builder here might be thinking of 35 to 50 completions per outlet on a site. So if you've got 4 developers on a site, maybe 200. Whereas we might view custom build as a slow process for a few people, other countries see custom build as something that can be rolled out very quickly because they're using design codes to coordinate the street arrangement right down to party wall construction. They're using custom build to build townhouses, terraces, and typologies that are difficult to get your average UK volume house builder to build. And if you get a volume house builder to bring in a new house type on a site, that's a result because it isn't simply they're committed to pattern books. They have a supply chain for all of their components, which they're wanting to feed. They're not going to want to depart from that. So I think custom build, housing associations, housing groups, people who want to build a few houses together, that is something that local authorities could help and enable. And I think there's lessons to be learned from the Charwell development in particular.
Yes, I think that's all good advice. And the point about the fact that the planning system and the large volume developers seeming to be in hock to one another, I think that's a fair point as well. Right, the poll is closed and the poll results are being shared, or I can see them. I'm assuming everybody else can see them. So let's just take a look at what we have. So the first question, what is your organisation's view of the importance of design? Well, that's excellent. Most of you present think that your organisations think that design matters. Now, some of you may think that 62% isn't high enough. Okay, a third don't think the design matters, but I think that's a very positive result. How well equipped is your authority for resourcing design codes? Well, yeah, and let's just look at the next question. Do your members need design training? Well, that links into Lucy's question, which she put in the chat, which is about resourcing, which those two questions deal with. I'm going to stop sharing the poll because I think we've covered those results. Let me close that down. So Lucy says, I think everyone has raised the concern that resourcing and funding is the #1 issue. I say boom again. And so what is the answer? She wants the answer for the short term. Lucy, you are an ambitious lady. There is the funding pool for the pilot projects, but what about everybody outside, whoever those chosen few will be? Paul's disappeared from my screen. It might be that his hour is up and he's had to go back to his workshop. So Roger, would you like to give a view on the funding conundrum?
Well, I think this is in Lucy's question is in particularly related to the design coding.
It is, but
question. I briefly touched on that in my presentation, and I think to expect local authorities to produce the level of detailed design coding across all their areas almost from the outset is really such a big ask. I'm not sure it's even needed. You could produce them according to where the imminent pressures are, so you kind of pace yourself. I don't know that it's a good idea to fix design codes for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, because they're not going to be robust enough to last that long. There will be requirements to modify codes because situations change? What if the developer comes along and he comes forward with a better idea for part of the area you've coded? So there has to be some flexibility on the codes. And I think a better way forward might be to divide coding up into sort of 3 levels of precision. So the first one, the broad brush, which might be similar to the sort of bylaw codes of streets that Robert was talking about, Andrew. So your growth strategy is accompanied by some simple principles for those streets, which is I'd call level 1 of a code, and then you add further detail to that later on. It's something I'm going to be encouraging the urban design to go back to government with on the consultation on the design codes. So you build on the codes incrementally. So I think a phased approach like that would make it more manageable than trying to produce the level of design coding proposed by the illustrations in the document.
Andrew?
I don't have much to add to that. I think it's very difficult if you're under-resourced to be able to respond to everything, and even putting it in the hands of developers, you've got to take the time to review everything that's come to you in any case. So there's the design panels out there, but there's a cost involved for those as well. It might be that they can be used and charged to developers or landowners. But yeah, in the short term, there needs to be a recognition that we need to get more skills into the industry, I think, and that, you know, planning teams are an incredibly valuable resource of local authorities that are creating the future, and it's going to be there for 50 to 100 years. We don't want to get it wrong. It was really interesting, something that I think Roger might have said in relation to the Oxfordshire street design guide, that if we're putting together a guide that's going to inform what development looks like for 50 years, and that development is 50 billion worth of development, why not spend a little bit of resource on getting it right and making sure that we're building a really good quality environment? And that's partly why I'm interested in the viability argument. I think Roger's talked a lot about the kind of paradigm shift in how we tax things and deliver them in terms of the plan making process. And I think that's right. I also think I clearly haven't fed the cat enough food. I also think that it's a slightly odd system, the way Section 106 and those kind of payments work. If a local community wants a certain type of house or style or design, and that ends up costing a little bit more, that might be a good thing because it might be robust and long lasting. The streets might need less maintenance. Do we then lose affordable housing? Or do we start saying, well, you've got, for everything, there's a viability appraisal. And in fact, it's not new development that creates a need for education. It's people having babies who then grow up to need to go to school. And development is just responding to population growth. So, okay, getting these things in the right place is quite important. So you might need to build a new primary school so it's accessible. But developments contributing to secondary school places, they don't really give rise to the need for more secondary. So maybe there's a process there that should be looked at again. How do all of these things work? It's always seen as new developments have this huge impact on infrastructure. And, you know, it used to always be traffic when you go to public consultation is the main issue. But we're quite often now getting, well, the doctor's surgeries are all full and new development will make them fuller. Well, I suppose it will if lots of people are coming into the area from outside. And I think that's part of the agenda for sort of balancing development across the country that Paul was referring to. But actually, in principle, a lot of doctors' surgeries are full because they're slightly under-resourced. And it's not development that puts a demand on them. It's people having children to some extent who grow up and get old. And we've got an aging population that puts demands on those kind of systems. I don't know that it's new development that should pay for that. And it strikes me, because local people see it that way, there's a kind of mismatch. I do think when people go to public consultation, before they ask the traffic question, they should be asked, do you drive a car? And are you creating a burden on the streets? Because it's not just up to new people not to drive and not to have an impact. It's up to all of us as a society. So I guess I've rambled into another topic. But I do think the way finance works probably needs an overhaul, and I see this as the one opportunity to do that in the next kind of generation, because I do think Nicholas Boyce-Smith has a background in finance as well as a very strong interest in design. So yeah, it's an opportunity there. I see it.
Well, that's quite an interesting thought. We'll turn his attention next to sorting out how the development industry finances public benefits. I wonder whether there's an opportunity in terms of design codes to set up a circular fund. Now, I don't know that this would work, and I can see problems with what I'm going to suggest, but whether it could be set up as a land charge or using Section 106 or some other mechanism, that the local authority would create a pot that would fund the first design code. As those properties are sold, they would pay money back into that pot, which would then fund subsequent design codes. So you only ever have to fund one. As a thought, I just put it out there, and it's something that if I was still ahead of planning, I would be exploring. Now we have another question from Aude Pontel. And this question, I think, is the best question because she's talking about climate change. And frankly, that is the issue of our time, and everything else is a sideshow. And Aude seems to think the same thing. So she says, how do we ensure that the community engagement around design works in favour of solving the urgent climate change agenda rather than detract from it? I wonder if we will have lengthy parochial debates about detailed materials rather than strategic views on resilient places. Now, given the time, I think this is probably be our last question. So it's quite a big one. Andrew, I'm going to ask you to go first.
I'll make one quick point then, and I think it's very difficult to do that, and you need to ensure you're consulting with everyone and using the tools to do that. We've seen through neighbourhood plans that it tends to be those with the loudest voice that don't want development near them, and so the development goes elsewhere. It's not done on the basis of where should development go to next grow most logically, as Roger was explaining before. And that's key to the sustainability issue. Are you on a transport network? Are you near to a local centre? So making sure we engage with wider community and things like civic societies where they exist.
Roger.
I think it's a great question too. At the moment, people engage with their local plan if there's imminent development on the piece of land next to them, and they have a reasonable expectation of what would happen on that piece of land if development goes ahead, and they don't much like it, so they start haggling over materials, etc. But if you had a local plan approach that was more strategic, more visionary, dare I say, and set out, here are the visions we have for the growth of our town. These are the options, these are the issues we're addressing, of which climate change would be at the top. And that vision was illustrated. There were simple plans and drawings where you could have a feel for what might happen. Then I think people would engage in a far more positive way than the negative approach you get at the moment, which is, well, not sure we want that bit of development quite like that. So I guess I'm bit more optimistic. And I think if local planning can be more visionary, then I think that will bring out the sort of better side in people to engage with that.
Yes, it's actually quite a hard thing really to answer this question, because it really goes to the heart of the whole planning, design, sustainable development debate. I wonder whether we are all informed enough about just how urgent climate change is. And I do wonder whether people will look back in history and wonder how on earth could we be so worried about beauty when in 10 years' time the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere will mean that there is only a chance of a declining quality of life for human beings on the planet. And that's not an extreme view, that's just the view of the science. So it does seem as though we've got our priorities somewhat in a mess, and really the design code endeavour should be about making sure that nothing that is built new emits any carbon, and somehow funds retrofitting of existing dwellings, which seems to be something that the government isn't interested in putting together a long-term plan for. But I really am going off piste from the subject of our seminar today. So I think it's time to say thank you very much, everyone, for coming. I hope you found it useful. Thank you to our 3 speakers, and I hope to see you on the next BOBMK seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Penelope.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you very much, Penelope. I know it's been difficult with the missing speaker today, but hopefully everyone found it useful, informative. I've sent a link out to our feedback, so please do complete. Thank you. See you again soon.
We've lost Andrew, haven't we?
We lost both of Andrews.
Can we exclude those that are still here? Because they may be going,
yes,
maybe having their lunch. Well done. And I'm sorry, I forgot to say about the feedback form. So here we are.
That's okay, no worries. It's all been a bit hectic for me.
Yes.
I've been checking and checking to see if he's turning up, getting in touch with me, sending me an email, sending me a message. I've sent a message to his colleagues, and I've never ever had that before at all.
No, it's very unusual. Very unusual. So feedback, Roger?
Yeah, and also, you know,
I was just wondering what Roger's feedback was on our event.
Well, first of all, well done for keeping it going. It was pretty seamless,
well
despite the juggling.
Good.
And didn't come first.
Hmm?
It's a pity the last question on the chat didn't come first, because that led into so many things.
Yes.
And the thing that got me into realizing there was something far more important than architecture was reading Ian McHarg's Design with Nature when I was going through School of Architecture. And we just don't seem to produce environmental planners.
Yeah.
Which is, it ought to be the starting point for producing a plan.
Yeah.
Or reviewing a plan for anywhere is looking at the environment,
Yeah.
which encompasses climate. That's
Yeah.
the starting point.
Yeah.
Where do you build? Where do you not build?
Yeah.
And that just that seems missing. I got stronger views about local plans than I want to present, given the audience is coming from local government, because you don't want to slag everybody off, so you try and put it in a logical form. But I think we're being completely let down by the preoccupation of local plans and kind of trying to hit a 5-year housing supply with a spreadsheet running on sites. It's and it is not being tackled in the planning reforms. But I'm getting off.
Well, it's perhaps a subject for a future.
In saying that, because we sort of talking about how today went. So,
but it is perhaps a subject for the seminar, Roger. How do we make local plans service what we want to happen, not service the machine? It's a huge. How do we get local plans in the service of design? Because without local plans doing the right thing, we're pissing in the wind, really.
We are. And I'd imagine everybody attending today has gone through their planning course or whatever because they wanted to make the world a better place. They were motivated by doing that. Yeah. And yet almost all of us are kind of signed up to turning a handle.
Yeah.
A process that is not delivering.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm hopeful that enough of that came across. I didn't recognize many of the names attending. It could be because I'm just not plugged in. But people I know with their hands on local plans in some of the authorities.
Well, I do wonder how much the people that come to BOBMK events are the remnants of people in local authorities that are still the designers, and how much local planners ever come to BOBMK events because they don't see themselves as doing design, so it's not for them. Yeah,
that's a thought. That's a good insight.
And development management planners too. I don't know how many of them come.
Yeah.
So we've got a BOBMK
quite a few
soon, haven't we?
Yeah, week after next. Yeah, so we do get a very good range of local authorities and lots of planners. I did used to start to invite lots of local architects and, lots of other, private sector to sort of mix it up a bit. But because the demand from the local authorities has just gone up and we're on a limit with Zoom, I've sort of stopped inviting, the wider world really out of the industry, which is a shame, I think, in one respect, because they sort of bring quite a lot of insight of what they're doing as well. But there is such a demand now of the local authorities. But I'm starting to get some feedback now, and the feedback is good and very good. So
good.
That's good. After it always seems difficult, when you're trying to organize something in the background, I just have to sit and let it go, knowing that things are going wrong without speakers being there and things. But if people are coming back saying they found it useful, then that's good news for us. And well done, Roger, well done, Andrew, and well done, Paul, because he obviously wasn't here for the whole session either. So that's been a challenge today, Penelope, hasn't it?
It has. But I think the best presentation, and I'm not just saying this because Roger is still on the call, but the best presentation by far was yours, Roger. It was clear, and it took me back to the heady days when I was an urban designer and I could think about quality. And you setting out the fact that design it's called town planning for a reason. It's happened to be called town planning, not town design. But what's in a word? Oh, if only.
Yeah. Does BOBMK post these sessions? Are they are they on YouTube or anything? It's recorded, or is it just archived? Or
Yes.
Well, as with everything at a council, it's a bit of a job for me to get these things to work. I have to keep asking questions to the IT admins. Can they unlock this and can they change that? And everything I have to put in a request for. So I've had to put in a request. Can I put files in the chat so I can post agendas? I don't know. I've had to put in a request to turn off noises and doorbells on waiting rooms. You know, it is very basic. And I'm currently on a request that, because the problem being is the last recording of the last session was 7 gig or something, and like the WeTransfer limit's like 2.5 gig, so I can't spread it out, and we don't have FTP systems that I can load it onto. So
can you load it up?
I think it just gets complicated.
Can you load it up onto YouTube and create a BOBMK YouTube channel? Because I've discovered that
I'm gonna try that next.
I managed to do it myself yesterday or the day before, and I was surprised that I could do it really quite quickly and easily.
Yeah.
I don't know
Really? Oh well, I'll try that next.
I don't know how many meg of storage
You know,
before you have to start paying, but it might be worth a quick look.
Yeah, I was going to set one up before, but you just get so diverted. You try to do this and you try and do that. Yeah. And we're so sort of restricted of the things we can do. I used to use a channel called Vimeo all the time, but, you know, I have to pay for Vimeo. So that's a good idea, Penelope. I'll check that one out because, you know, I want to post these up because people are really interested in them after the event. So it'd be good to sort of...
Because of course we're still recording ourselves, so we'll need to edit the end of this before we post it.
Crikey, yeah, we are.